Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wait a couple of minutes to allow folks to join our broadcast for this installation of Lunch and Learn. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to allow a couple seconds for folks to join the call. All right. Thank you all so much for your patience. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. Thank you for being here today. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here today for this installation of Lunch and Learn. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Levine, and I'm the Manager of Adult Services for Programs and Outreach here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you so much for joining us for the July edition of Lunch and Learn, Stolen, Kidnapping and Enslavement in Antebellum America, in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bert to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone to this month's Lunch and Learn lecture. It is always a pleasure to thank our partners, the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library, for making these webinars possible. Now, all three partners are keen to share Maryland's 4 centuries of dramatic history. With over half a century in the Maryland history business, I have a mission, and that mission is to get serious history in front of the public. I and my colleagues are presently in the anniversary business. Anniversaries are the best time to get good history into the agenda, to assess where we've been and where we are going. And our current national situation suggests we need that now. We call ourselves the Maryland's 4 Centuries Project because the run-up to the state's 400th birthday in 2034 offers many opportunities to explore Maryland's rich history. 2034 still seems pretty far off, so we also focus on another upcoming anniversary. Maryland has a new 250th commission under Governor Moore. Its job is to plan the state's participation in the nation's 250th birthday, and that's coming up in 2026. Now, we are working with the director of that commission to promote some serious Maryland history on a statewide level. On our Maryland 400 Facebook page, you will find a Maryland Monday First in the U.S. every week. We showcase how influential our state has been in the development of the nation, in both good ways and not so good ways. The people, places, events, objects, documents, and buildings that happened first in our 23 counties in Baltimore paint a great profile of our state's history. These historical pieces can promote some serious discussion of that history and their links to current issues. We hope to create an important legacy during the 2026 anniversary that could lead into the 400th. One constant in these examples is Maryland's role as a border state, giving us both tensions and creativity. This border state conflict is most evident in the troubles that led to our terrible Civil War. But it exists today still as North-South and East-West divisions. Today's lecture is a story of that fraught time before the Civil War. Although the events you will hear about today happened beyond Maryland's borders, there were other similar examples in Maryland that underline the constant dangers that African Americans, both enslaved and free, faced in their everyday lives. The Underground Railroad was a dangerous route for escaping slaves, but there was also a reverse Underground Railroad. Black marketeers stole free people off the streets. They took them south to feed the insatiable labor needs of the cotton plantations. Now, Baltimore had the largest free urban population of African Americans in the whole nation before the Civil War. And we can only imagine the potential peril that someone faced just walking down the streets of Baltimore. Disappeared, kidnapped, never to be seen or heard from again. Today we'll hear one of the amazing stories about this reverse railroad. This generation of historians has a mission to uncover these stories. Now, Dr. Richard Bell is an award-winning history professor at my alma mater, the University of Maryland in College Park. He knows how to find an important story, and then he knows how to tell it well. With my background in the public history world, I particularly appreciate Dr. Bell's willingness to lend his considerable talents to promoting history in public institutions around the state. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Bell.
Thanks so much for that, Bert. And I want to begin with some other acknowledgements. First, to our wonderful ASL interpreter today, who we're going to try and keep very busy over the next hour. Second, to all our partners, beginning with the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Libraries are the oxygen of democracy. I think we know that now more than ever. So thank you very much to everyone at Enoch Pratt for making this platform available to talk about difficult aspects of American history. Also to the Maryland State Archives, where I'm on the board of commissioners, and to the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore, which Bert is a former leader thereof. I'm here in New York today doing research for another book, but through the miracle of this technology, we're going to talk today together about a very difficult aspect of the history of our region, Pennsylvania and Maryland and the borders in between. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen, which is always a moment of truth for any presenter online. And I think as of about now, you can see my slides and hear my voice and maybe even see my face. And therefore, we should get going. We'll have time at the end, of course, for your comments and questions. So don't hesitate to pose them.
Looks all good, Rick.
Thank you for confirming that. I appreciate it. Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old and he was trapped. Cornelius was stuck, locked in the belly of a small ship that probably looked a lot like this one, that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's market an hour ago, shoved a black gag across his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him here. It was dark below the ship's waterline, but Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down here. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him. 4 other black boys. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was shorter and smaller than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were enslaved, prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep South. if their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August 1825. He was one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, that city was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Philadelphia's gridded streets and tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings, turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. They did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time as the city of brotherly love, as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of the American anti-slavery movement. But to criminals, to kidnappers, of course, none of that mattered. In truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. This was a product of its location. It was the nearest major free city on the East Coast to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just about 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, including Maryland, where I live. As Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery, in the 50 years after the American Revolution, that boundary along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, the Mason-Dixon seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free states from several southern slave states. Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made its many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states like Maryland. And they would prey on the members of the city's free black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. The people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, three of the new territories and states rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut their sugarcane and pick their cotton, and they would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Buying a small percentage of their forced laborers from kidnappers of free black people was not likely their first choice, but their options were narrowing. Planters in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808. That was the year that lawmakers in Washington had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them here in the United States. That 1808 decision was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America, because by cutting off the legal international supply of enslaved people, it spurred the growth of a replacement. It spurred the growth of an American, internal, domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the US tried to satisfy these Southwestern settlers' demand for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland that were in surplus and where some planters were willing to sell. And that was all legal. And it was big business too. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more than that. And the stronger their demand, the more tempting, the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children like Cornelius from northern cities like Philadelphia, launder them into that legal supply chain I've just described, and then sell them in this vast new Southwestern slave market. Those economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of a nationwide kidnapping operation. It had become the largest northern depot of something I call America's reverse underground railroad. So when I use that phrase today, reverse underground railroad, I'm referring to what I just described, the kidnapping and trafficking into Southern slavery of free black people from northern cities like Philly. This reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they ran in opposite directions, and they existed for completely different purposes. But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of one another. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek usually northwards, dreaming of new lives, new opportunities in freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free black people were stolen from northern cities like Philadelphia and were made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman from Maryland risked their lives and their liberty to help black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated only by money. Both of these networks, one obviously heroic and courageous, the other, of course, evil and monstrous, both of these networks roared to life in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North and the South. Both networks were loosely organized and opportunistic. Both ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants and forged documents and disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and victims of kidnapping made to go south, the routes were largely the same. And they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was also roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of black adults and children across state lines, half towards freedom, half towards enslavement. I think most Americans by now know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad. Historians have spent decades, after all, studying the strategies and tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. The achievements of American heroes like Tubman now command our attention, and there are Underground Railroad walking tours, TV shows, museums. There's a recent movie, all of them dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. But I think we know far less about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors and station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. The identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even today. They certainly never gave public lectures about their work or went on fundraising tours. Only rarely did their names and crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile in surviving legal sources the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, protected by too much indifference and apathy among ordinary Americans who knew what they were doing and did nothing to stop it. The outlaws who built America's reverse Underground Railroad left few business records or bundles of private letters for historians like me to read and examine. Kidnappers don't generally write memoirs or pose for paintings or photographs, a fact which has left journalists and activists of their time to simply guess, as you see here in this image, as to what these kidnappers might have looked like. No one posed for this engraving. Yet, despite all that whitewashing and amnesia, as I argue in my new book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in this book begins, but about every town or city in our region with a free Black population, so that would include Baltimore City. If we think not just about 1825, when this true story begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free Black Americans, many of them children like Cornelius who were under the age of 16. And let me be very clear here, most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched frantically for them. They lobbied, petitioned, and advertised. They waited in earnest for news, but usually nothing and no one came back. Free Black people in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore had very few white allies in this period of American history, beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, while city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white-on-black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, Their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors, magistrates, and policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, search property, and interrogate suspects. Even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews knew exactly what to do, exactly what to say, to talk their way out of trouble and get back to work. I'm guessing all of us have heard of 12 Years a Slave by now. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northup. He was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Northup later escaped his enslavement in the South. It took him 12 years to do it, but he did it. And then he returned home and he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he published in 1853, Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed, white conmen lured him into New York City, where I'm sitting now, from his home upstate in 1841. At the time, Northup was a well-educated, prosperous musician in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, they wined him and dined him, and if you remember the movie, you remember they drugged him too. Then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northup was soon forced onto a slave ship bound for New Orleans. There he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his sugar cane fields. 10 years ago, in 2013, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to Northup's ordeal. But both the memoir and the movie offer, I think, misleading views of the people whom the agents of the reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. It turns out, folks, that Northup's experience on America's reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. These kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. No, they preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with tricks that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on their own 2 feet, to walk there in small, specialized overland convoys known as coffles. And their walking prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. They were vastly more likely to be sold off in 1s and 2s along the way, in furtive, all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more human beings as property, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. All of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my recent book, Stolen. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto a ship just outside Philadelphia, which of course is in the top right of this map. Then their captors warehoused them for a while in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line, just above the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen. This is a Maryland story too, you see. And then their kidnappers marched them onwards, out of Delaware and Maryland and halfway across this vast continent towards the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 free children as slaves. It was a soul-destroying journey for these children. It's a journey of 2 million human steps, by the way. In the interest of time today, I'm going to pass over much of this story, though in the book I have a lot to say about it. Likewise, my publisher requires me to pass over much of this book's astonishing second half, in which readers learn that some, though not all, of these 5 boys make a miraculous escape and begin the astonishing Odyssey home to Philadelphia, referred to in the book's subtitle. All I can say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen was indeed astonishing to them and to me. It would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the grave, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. Instead of breaking my contract with my publisher and telling you everything that happens in this book, let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next has never before been told. And I think for understandable reasons. Remember, Cornelius was a child at the time. He came from a hard-up family that was not the sort to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And this is a problem, of course, because this is a true story. It's history. Historians need sources, lots of them, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are fair and true. The stories and struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind rich troves of papers, diaries, or memoirs often remain untold and unstudied as a result. So what do? Well, all I can tell you is what I did. To reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing everything I could from a small packet of letters written to or from the mayor of Philadelphia, a man who belatedly wades into this story. And I turned to coverage of Cornelius's case in a single anti-slavery magazine that took an interest at the time. And to be clear, historians have known about these modest sources for some time. But on their own, they turn out to be too few, too thin to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing odyssey into and out of slavery. So I had to go looking elsewhere, digging around in pretty much any archive I could find, including the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis and the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore, for scraps of other information that, when put together, could help flesh this all out. Along the way, there's been a lot of days spent finding nothing at all, looking for needles in haystacks, finding only lots of hay. But ultimately, I think it's been worth it. Over 6 years of research for this book, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles in those haystacks. New sources about this case buried within 35 archives in 14 states and the District of Columbia. Among those things I found was the notes, the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial which would decide the fate of one of these boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered a pair of letters in which one of his kidnappers names his accomplices and describes their roles in this specific kidnapping. An amazing discovery. But most affectingly of all, at least for me, was this. A missing persons notice written by Cornelius's grieving father. It's short, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. As he had no cause and never before absented himself, it's feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout built, thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than the right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair." Folks, as you can imagine, I've read this ad hundreds of times in the course of researching this book. Every time I read it, two of the words in front of you jump out at me like they're written 60 foot high, like they're written in neon on the side of a building. Afflicted parents. All of us are children of parents. Many of us are parents of children or grandchildren. I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. The thought that my children could be snatched away from me and there'd be nothing useful I could do to get them back, that just tears at me, rips at me in a really primal way. Afflicted parents. To me, that reads like the understatement of the 19th century. So before Bert and I seek your comments and questions, I want to wrap up now with a couple of hopefully very brief reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. So any true story about free children ripped from their American families and swallowed up by American slavery is worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention, I think, for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in many American towns and cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, and that Black freedom in those places was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I've said, I'm not at liberty to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half, or tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. We want you to read the book. You can find it in Enoch Pratt and your local library. But in case you don't read the book, I am going to drop a few big hints now. I will say here that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save Cornelius and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize Black communities across the free states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. Their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well. Their efforts would encourage white abolitionists, like the 2 white women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet, to focus the Northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families forcibly separated by kidnappers, slave catchers, slave traders, and by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. This 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage Southerners and slaveholders and kidnappers more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. Its passage set in motion a chain of court challenges to it and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery, pro-kidnapping abomination that put this country on a collision course with civil war. To conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse underground railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him and the things that he and the other boys made happen next would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy must never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of this small story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. Thank you very much indeed, folks. Before we pivot to Bert and your comments and questions, I do want to say this talk is obviously based around my recent book, Stolen. I hope you will go find it in your local library and support public libraries any way you can. If anyone listening would like a signed copy of the paperback, I'd of course be happy to sell you one. All you have to do is email me at the email address you see on the screen, or look me up on the University of Maryland website where you'll find that same email address. But do turn to your libraries first. That's what we're here to raise up. So with that, I'm going to take my slides down, and I'm happy to put them back up later on if people need them. But I'm going to stop sharing, so anyone on the stream should be able to see me a bit more clearly. I can see Emily and our very busy interpreter, and I'm going to see if we can get some comments and questions going.
Yeah, so we have quite a few comments coming in. Paula from Facebook says that she's just finished reading the book and she found it very informative. So thank you, Paula, for that. We have another viewer who has asked a few questions. The first question from #WeOut is, what made you interested in Solomon's story? How did you come about it? And also, what made you interested in Cornelius's story and how did you come about it?
Yeah, what great questions to get us kicked off. Thanks for that, Emily, and thanks for the questioner as well. So I began the research for this book about Cornelius and the other boys in, I think, 2011. And I was about a year into the research when someone told me, oh, do you know they're making a movie of 12 Years a Slave, the Solomon Northup book? And I had glanced at that book in graduate school. I knew it existed. I knew it was the story of a middle-aged man who'd been kidnapped from New York, but I did not know its details. And to be honest, as an historian, I had pretty low expectations for the movie. A lot of historians often hate a lot of historical movies because they get so many things wrong. But the movie of 12 Years a Slave, I think, is one of the great standouts of American cinema of the last 20 years. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to take a look. It is very hard to watch, which of course is the point. There is no sugarcoating of Northup's ordeal in the movie they made in 2013, which perhaps is one reason why it won as many Oscars as it did. I came to Cornelius's story 2 years before the movie came out of 12 Years a Slave, when I was finishing up research on a different book about suicide in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War, a very dark book, as you can probably imagine. As I was finishing it up, a friend of mine sent me a newspaper clipping from an old newspaper from 1829 from Delaware. And it brought the news to readers in Delaware of the alleged suicide of a woman in jail facing charges for slave trading. Her name was Patty Cannon, which many people on this side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge have never heard before. But that's a name that on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, a lot of people even today would recognize. Patty Cannon, it turns out, was one of the most prolific, notorious, and evil kidnappers of free Black people to ever live. And she lived on Maryland's eastern shore near the Delaware line. And by the 1820s, she was the co-leader of a gang that kidnapped free Black people with greater frequency than any other gang in the United States, including the one that kidnapped Northup several years later. When I discovered her alleged suicide, I'd never heard of her. And I was embarrassed that I'd never heard of her. So I began digging into her life. I realized who she was when she was alive. And I realized how many other gangs like hers were doing very similar things, kidnapping free Black Americans from Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, you name it, and making a lot of money that way. So I wrote this book to educate myself. I realized if I didn't know this stuff and I was a professional historian, maybe other people didn't know it either. So I wrote the book to educate myself about the frequency of kidnapping of Black Americans, and then to share its findings, Emily, with as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm. And Jim is asking, and there's some other questions, but this is pertinent. Jim is asking, will Stolen ever become a movie?
Well, Jim, if you have Oprah Winfrey on speed dial, then please put in a good word for me next time you're there, Jim. Yes, so the answer is we are very hopeful, Simon & Schuster and I, that this will reach a wider audience as the years go by. There is a script based on this book of mine, which is being shopped around producers in Hollywood as we speak. Maybe it will get made, maybe it won't. There's no way to know. But I can tell you that beyond the hardback and paperback, that you can access not just a Kindle version, but also a audiobook version, which I think is very professional and very profound. If you're wondering, by the way, the narrator in the audiobook is not me. I have a British accent, which I think would be the wrong choice for this story. So they hired an actor in New York, and he did a fantastic job on the audiobook. So that's reaching a lot of people who don't read as many books as they used to.
So what you're saying is that there's hope for this.
There's always
for Jim.
hope, Emily. But if you have friends in Hollywood, please give them a call.
All right. So Denise has a couple of questions. She says that research for this book must have been extraordinarily frustrating based on your commentary. What was the first signal that you got that you were going to write this book and this story? And what was the longest time that you couldn't find any evidence for your book and story or your story while you were writing?
Oh, Denise, what great questions. You sound like a writer yourself, like you've been through this. Let me explain. I told you that I came into this story backwards through one of the kidnappers, Patty Cannon. And as I got into the project, I thought I would write a biography of this evil woman, Patty Cannon, to try to understand what on earth she thought she was doing, kidnapping Black people from freedom in cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. And that's how I started. But the longer I spent with Patty Cannon, the more impossible for my own mental health continuing that project became. I did not like getting up in the morning every day and going to live in Patty Cannon's head for another day. So at some point early on in the project, maybe a year in, I pivoted dramatically, making Patty Cannon no longer the subject, the main focus of the book, and making these 5 boys who she kidnapped the prime focus of the book. So it's been my privilege ever since to get to know these boys, to try and understand their lives as free people before they were kidnapped, to try to bring to your attention the astonishing things they would do to free themselves and to bring their kidnappers to justice. In some ways, this is a love letter to these 5 boys and what they were able to accomplish by the end of this astonishing story. So that's what really kept me going in some sense, Denise. But when it comes to doing the research, this was the hardest thing I've ever done as a professional historian, for all the reasons I gave in the talk about the lack of available sources. So I had to be very creative, not just digging around for new sources about this case, but for using existing sources about other cases very creatively to speak to this particular case. So let me give you just one example and then I'll shut up. The chapter I'm proudest of in this book is the chapter where I had the least amount to go on in writing it. It's one of the 2 chapters where I describe their journey from basically Maryland to basically Mississippi. 2 of these boys would later give testimony in court in which they'd describe their kidnapping experience. But neither boy dwelled on the journey itself. Neither boy spent more than 100 words describing for officials in court what the journey was like. So I had 200 words spread between 2 boys from them about what the journey was like. And yet I knew I had to write a 5,000-word chapter at least about this ordeal for historians, for readers to be able to follow along. And 200 words was not enough to base that on. So I went looking for other sources to help me contextualize or flesh out what that journey must have been like. I turned to 3 bodies of sources. I turned to accounts written by other survivors who'd made similar journeys. Northup went by sea, not by land, but he gives you some psychological insight into what it's like to be ripped apart from your family and taken away. I turned to the surviving records of legal slave traders who would often write reports from the road about what they saw on the day's ride and how the enslaved people they were transporting were reacting to their alienation. Those were useful. But I also turned, perhaps somewhat more creatively, to a body of sources written by rich European travelers visiting the American South in this period. Think of this as like the Grand Tour, but in, the Deep South. And these rich European travelers were often on their way from Washington to New Orleans to see the mighty Mississippi River. And they travel in fancy carriages all that distance. And because they got bored on the journey, they would look out the window and often write down in a sort of diary what they saw out of the window. And so from these rich European travelers, I have incredibly detailed descriptions of the geography and climate that these 5 boys would have experienced as they were walking those same trails. And every now and then, these rich European travelers would actually see convoys of walking black men and children under the command of slave traders or kidnappers. It was impossible to tell. And they would write about those convoys trudging past their carriage windows. And every European traveler who saw one of these convoys always used the same language to describe what those adults and children looked like as they trudged past. They always said, "My God, they look like they're on their way to a funeral." And that in itself, I thought, was immensely evocative of the psychological experience of being forced to leave your family behind in freedom and marching towards enslavement further south.
Mm. And Denise has chimed in, and I won't give any spoilers, but she says, given the outcome, it must have been ultimately very gratifying to write this book and tell this story. We do have time for one.
I'll just say very quickly, Emily, I'm not going to spoil the outcome, but I have told you that some of these 5 boys survived this story. So if you squint, you can call this a happy ending. But what I want to emphasize is just how unusual any sort of happy ending was for stories that begin like this, right? I'm able to write this book because some people fought their way back to freedom and blew the whistle. But many other stories begin the exact same way and do not end with survivors returning to their family and loved ones and being reunited.
We have time for one more question. The BAHS school counselors, if you want to clue me in on what that stands for, I'd be happy to put your full name on this call. The BAHS school counselors ask, based on your historical research about the slave trade, kidnappers, et cetera, what are your thoughts on reparations?
Oh, goodness, right. I have complicated and evolving thoughts about reparations. The first thing I want to say is that the reasons to engage in restorative justice seem obvious to me. The generations of trauma and discrimination and exploitation and exclusion and segregation perpetrated against descendants of slavery, African-descended descendants of slavery in this country, are so egregious that the idea that nothing should be done to make some amends seems pathological at this point. However, what to do to engage in restorative justice is a more difficult question on which I think good people can and do disagree. So I just encourage folks to engage with serious people who are thinking about potential ideas to make restorative justice work. And I just remind you that we in the US and people around the world have done this before with success. There were reparations for victims of Japanese internment in World War II. There have been restorative justice efforts in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, in Germany, following their own difficult, tangled, troubled pasts. This is something that is far more feasible than many, I think, are willing to acknowledge. So I just encourage you to go in with an open mind and engage in that debate.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And to clarify, this was Bel Air High School's Counselor Lori. Thank you so much for your great question. And thank you so much for this very informative and lovely presentation today, Rick. We have really enjoyed having you. Thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archive and to the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Thank you again very, very much to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing us with accessibility for today's program. And thank you all to our audience for joining us this afternoon. Your attendance allows these programs to be possible. Please take a moment to fill out the program survey at the end and conclusion of this program. And we hope to see you next month at Lunch and Learn. Everyone is commenting how great your presentation was. Thank you so much, Rick. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure too. Thank you.
Everybody take care. We're going to end the broadcast now. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.